Here with our last video to finish out Chapter 19, we're going to look at the processes of both, I should have labeled this, both alveolar gas exchange and gas exchange out in the peripheral tissues. So we're going to come back to look at external respiration and internal respiration one last time. But first we got to understand a little bit about the structure of the alveoli themselves. The wall of the alveolus is a simple squamous epithelium with a little bit of basement membrane right behind it, right there. And that, of course, is dense irregular connective tissue, and it's supportive because the simple squamous epithelia are so delicate, so thin. And right nearby is a closely associated capillary network. And the capillary is built, if you recall, from the circulatory system, from endothelial cells, which are also a simple squamous epithelium. And so these layers, these three layers of alveoli, or alveolus epithelial tissue, basement membrane, and endothelium of the capillary, make up what's referred to as the respiratory membrane. Very thin layer across which gases can be exchanged by diffusion, by moving from high concentration to low concentration. And so this diffusion happens fairly rapidly because the concentration gradients are nice and high. You know, the difference between high oxygen and low oxygen here in the lung is nice. It's a good difference so that we can see rapid diffusion. And because the distance that the molecules must diffuse is so very short. So those two characteristics make this a very, very efficient means of exchanging gases. So the rate of diffusion is affected by actually several different factors here. The first is that there is so much surface area available inside the lungs. And of course, the more surface area, then the more diffusion can occur. The distance is very short. The gases are very soluble in lipids, so it rapidly makes its way across the plasma membranes of those endothelial cells and the simple squamous epithelium. And it also is very soluble in water, so it makes its way through the very thin layers of cytoplasm. And then finally, it's a steep concentration gradient because it's relatively high on the high side and relatively low on the low side. So lots of diffusion happens very quickly. So because the diffusion distance is short and because of the solubility of both oxygen and CO2, and because the pressure gradients, partial pressure gradients are steep, we see lots and lots of diffusion occurring in the lungs. Alright, so here we are at the alveolus, where we're doing external respiration. So that's, remember, gas exchange between the air of the external environment that's been brought into the lungs and the blood. So air in the lungs has a high oxygen concentration, and the plasma in the blood has a relatively low oxygen concentration. So O2 is high and O2 is low as blood is coming in from the arterial side of the capillary network. And remember, arteries and veins are reversed in their oxygen concentrations here because this is where we're doing the oxygenation of the blood. And so oxygen diffuses rapidly so that by the time the blood makes it to the far side of the capillary network, the partial pressures of O2 here and O2 here are equal. So it happens very, very rapidly. At the same time that oxygen is diffusing out, then CO2 is diffusing from high to low. So as we are bringing oxygen in, at the same time, CO2 is moving out of the blood. So that by the time the blood makes it past the alveolus, the CO2 concentrations are also equal. So the blood comes in high CO2, low O2. It leaves low CO2 high O2. Okay, partial pressures of CO2 are low, partial pressure of oxygen is high. Make sense? I hope so. Now, with internal respiration, so we've gotten the gases, so here we are at the lungs. Now here we are in the peripheral tissues. So as the blood heads back to the heart, it is rich in oxygen. As it heads out to the peripheral tissues, rich in oxygen, low in carbon dioxide. Now out here in the peripheral tissues, this is where we're using up oxygen. So the mitochondria in the cells, there's my little cartoon of what a mitochondria looks like. The mitochondria in the cells are using the oxygen. So the O2 is disappearing here. And as a result of making ATP, the mitochondria are producing CO2. So CO2 is being generated. And so as the blood comes into the peripheral tissues with high O2, that oxygen will diffuse out into the fluids and then on into the cells where it gets used up at the mitochondria to make ATP. Because remember, just in case you're forgetting, if you take glucose plus oxygen, you can make 36 or 38 ATPs, and we produce lots of water, 6 of them, if we have 6 oxygens, H2O, plus 6 CO2 molecules. So this is what's happening. This equation, part of the equation, is happening out here in the tissues. So we're using up that oxygen, but at the same time, so that when the blood is heading back to the heart again, before it makes it to the lungs once more, it's going to be low in O2, because we've used lots of the O2 there. It's diffused away from where it's high to where it's low inside the cells. At the same time, because CO2 is being generated in the cells, we're going to tuck CO2 into the blood, so that as the blood leaves the peripheral tissues, it'll be high in CO2. So when the blood comes back again, it's high CO2 and low O2. And then after it passes through the lungs doing external respiration once more, it'll be low CO2 and high oxygen. Alright, so how then do we carry oxygen and CO2? And we're going to start first with oxygen transport, the way that we carry oxygen. We load oxygen into the blood at the alveoli. So there's lots of oxygen here. It's high partial pressure at 104. The blood coming into the lungs is about 40 millimeters mercury partial pressure. So low, definitely. So that by the time the blood makes it past the alveolus, it is also at about 104 millimeters mercury, because there's just this constant flow of fresh air into the alveoli. Now, the first place that the oxygen goes, because remember, they're not showing it here, but there's direct contact between these two membranes. It goes straight into the plasma of the blood, but that's not where it stops. So if this is the blood vessel, and here is a red blood cell, some more red blood cells, the oxygen makes its way into the plasma first, but then it diffuses right on into the red blood cells. In the red blood cells, we have hemoglobin molecule, and I'm going to show it like a little 4-petaled flower. Each one of those petals can hold on to one molecule of oxygen. So each heme group, there are 4 heme groups, each heme group can hold a single oxygen molecule. So that we load up all of the hemoglobin inside the red blood cell with oxygen. So by the time we get all the blood loaded up, only about 2% is carried in the plasma. All the rest is carried either in the cytoplasm of the red blood cell or by the hemoglobin molecule itself. And when we attach oxygen to hemoglobin, we produce a molecule molecule that we refer to as oxyhemoglobin. So that's hemoglobin that's filled up with oxygen molecules. So that's how we load oxygen into blood. Now when we get out to do internal respiration out of the peripheral tissues, we've got to unload that oxygen. And it's only the oxygen that's in the plasma that can directly go into the tissues. So we have some O2 out here, right? So that O2 will diffuse out of the blood. Now, that allows the O2 that's dissolved in the cytoplasm of the red blood cells to diffuse out into the blood, because the concentration gradient now is low out here and higher inside the cytoplasm. And then that oxygen that just diffused out will then diffuse on out into the peripheral tissues. Now, it's harder to get the oxygens that are attached here at the hemoglobin off of the hemoglobin, because it binds really, really well out there, right? On that hemoglobin molecule. But there are two characteristics about tissues that are active that help us to unload oxygen. The first is that when you warm up hemoglobin, the oxygen tends to fall off more easily. And then the second thing is that if you make the atmosphere or the conditions inside that red blood cell slightly acidic, then that also causes or makes it easy for the oxygen to fall off the hemoglobin and go into the cytoplasm, and then on out of the cytoplasm into the plasma, and then on out of the plasma into the peripheral tissue fluids, and then from there into the cells. So it's this multi-step process of unloading, but the things that help it to happen are warmer blood and high and low pH blood. How can we make the blood a little bit lower in pH? That is where we get back to, that's one reason why I want you to know that equation about CO2 dissolved in oxygen. Remember, in water. If you dissolve CO2 in water, then you make that carbonic acid. And carbonic acid drops off hydrogen ions, making things acidic. So there's where the acidic stuff comes from. Because these tissues are active and making CO2 and putting it out there and moving it on into the blood becomes slightly acidic, which helps the oxygen to fall off the hemoglobin, go into the plasma, go across the membrane, the endothelium of the capillary, into the peripheral tissue fluids, and into the cells out in the peripheral tissues. And so the condition of hypoxia occurs when there's low oxygen conditions in tissues, and so that's the job then of respiration, is to prevent hypoxic tissues out there. Okay, so we've unloaded the oxygen from the blood. Now let's load up the carbon dioxide. And where do we load up carbon dioxide? Once again, out here in the peripheral tissues. Okay, so now we got to load up our carbon dioxide. So the cells are busy making CO2 here at the mitochondria. They're producing CO2. The CO2 diffuses out into the tissue fluids and then right on into the blood. Like with oxygen, only a small amount of CO2 is dissolved in blood plasma. Even more of it makes its way into the red blood cell. And as it goes into the red blood cell, it gets grabbed out of the cytoplasm and attached, if we think of this here as as our hemoglobin molecule, the actual location of binding for the oxygen is here at these little iron molecules that are in the middle of it. But the globin portion, the protein, globular protein part, can pick up and hold on to CO2 as well. And so a whole bunch of it, of the carbon dioxide, gets picked up as carbaminohemoglobin and attached to the hemoglobin inside the red blood cell. And yes, it's possible for a red blood cell's hemoglobin to actually carry carbon dioxide and oxygen at the same time. So that can be done. But here's the other thing. Remember what happens when you dissolve CO2 in water. CO2 plus water, CO2 plus water makes H2CO3, that's carbonic acid, which then drops off an oxygen. And or hydrogen, HCO. So it drops off a hydrogen, I can't write and talk at the same time, and leaves behind the bicarbonate ion. So some of the CO2 that's in the blood plasma is actually carried as bicarbonate ion. And some of that CO2 will diffuse into our red blood cell and do that equation and make carbonate ion inside the red blood cell. And this happens mostly inside the red blood cell because, you know, this chemical reaction will happen in water. But it happens more easily if we have an enzyme. That enzyme is named carbonic anhydrase. And that enzyme will help to produce carbonic acid more easily. And there's lots of carbonic anhydrase inside the red blood cell. So CO2 will diffuse into the red blood cell. Carbonic anhydrase will facilitate that reaction, and we produce lots and lots of bicarbonate ion and lots of the hydrogen ions as well. But, you know, proteins are just all purpose. They can also pick up those hydrogen ions too. So the blood inside the red blood cell doesn't get super acidic. It gets buffered by the hemoglobin molecule. Okay, so most then, what you got to keep in mind is most of the carbon dioxide is carried inside the red blood cell as bicarbonate ion. Even though that doesn't look like CO2, we made it there using carbonic anhydrase to facilitate that chemical reaction. All right, so now we've got, you know, I think that this is like my family when I was young going on family vacation. We had one of these 12-passenger conversion vans, and oh my gosh, there were so many little cabinets and nooks and crannies where we'd shove food and all of our, you know, ski clothes and food, ski clothes, luggage, gifts, everything that we were taking. And then there would be places where we would shove all of the kids that were in my family, 4 boys, so we'd shove them all in their places. And then, you know, we'd always have friends come along with us, so we'd have to shove them and their stuff everywhere. So we had all these little nooks and crannies that we could hide away all the stuff that we were carrying in this van so that we could, like, make it wherever we were going with our sanity intact. So that's exactly what the blood is doing. We tuck carbon dioxide in blood plasma as dissolved carbon dioxide and as bicarbonate ion, and we tuck it away inside red blood cells as dissolved carbon dioxide, as bicarbonate ion, and attached to the red blood cells, the hemoglobin, as carbaminohemoglobin. So lots of ways that we can carry it. So now we've got to go and unload it, and we do the unloading, of course, where we do external respiration, there at the lungs again. So as we saw with oxygen, it's only the dissolved CO2 that's dissolved in the plasma that can make its way out of the blood and into the air in the lungs. So how do we get, well, as soon as we get CO2 out of the, that's dissolved in the plasma, then any bicarbonate ion that we have in there, we can run that reaction in reverse. So rather than doing it this direction where we make carbonic acid that falls apart into hydrogen and bicarbonate ion, we turn around and we run the reaction in the opposite direction. We just find some hydrogen ions and we attach it on and make carbonic acid, and that falls apart into water and CO2. So now we can move the CO2 right on out that we had stored as bicarbonate ion. But we've still got all that dang bicarbonate ion inside the red blood cell. How can we get that stuff out too? Great question, right? So let's look and see. Here we can do something called the chloride shift. The chloride shift is made possible because in the membrane of the red blood cell are transport proteins. And those transport proteins are willing to swap a bicarbonate ion out if they can bring a chloride ion in. So no ATP required here. It's all facilitated diffusion. So all over the red blood cell then, we're doing this chloride shift, sending chloride ions in and bringing bicarbonate ions out. So as the chloride shift occurs, I'm going to go back one slide, we now have more bicarbonate ion dissolved in the blood plasma. Now you might ask yourself, why can't the bicarbonate ion just move right on out? It's not allowed to. Dadgummit, it's not allowed to do that. Ions don't move out very easily. But if we can do the chloride shift and send out bicarbonate ions and run this reaction in reverse, then we can send CO2 out. And then last of all, the carbaminohemoglobin will release its carbon dioxide. That leaves, goes out into the blood plasma, and then moves right on out into the lungs. So in that way, we get rid of all the carbon dioxide that we've tucked into all the nooks and crannies of my family's 12-passenger minivan, or at the very least, this red blood cell. Okay, so there you've got it. Internal respiration, where we're loading CO2 and unloading carbon and unloading oxygen. External respiration, where we're unloading the CO2 that we unloaded out there in the tissues and loading back in oxygen into the blood. And you've seen how we do it. So you know what to do. If you have questions, let me know about them. Study well.